Good morning and welcome to the 8th lecture of the distinction lecture series we have been having here at the Open University of Sri Lanka. Today's lecture will be delivered by Dr. Kathryn Chang Barker, who will be talking on the best way to predict future is to invent it. Dr. Kathryn Chang Barker is a consulting education futurist and strategist with a PhD in education administration and policy studies from the University of Alberta, Canada. She is currently higher educational expert advisor to the Minister of Education in Qatar and a visiting professor at Sultan Qaboos University in Oman and University of Science and Technology in China. Dr. Barker has experienced life and work in higher education in Canada, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Malaysia, China and Oman. She works with senior leadership using her cultural adaptability and extensive expertise in strategic and operational planning, environmental scanning and trend analysis, faculty development and teaching excellence, international education and internationalization, community engagement, lifelong learning, national standards development and accreditation, quality assurance mechanisms, ICT and learning technologies, e-portfolio implementation, operationalizing graduate attributes, leadership and innovation, and quality assurance. As founder and president of Future Ed Consulting Education Futuristic Incorporation, Dr. Barker has provided research and development in the education field since 1995. She has additional content expertise in fields of e-learning quality, workforce development, education reform in the context of global change, return on investments in learning systems, adult and workplace literacy, mobile learning, prior learning assessment and recognition of prior learning, occupational skill standards, human capital assets management, and various other learning and administrative innovations. As well, she has process expertise in professional research, project management, strategic and operational planning, futurist tools and strategies, policy development and analysis, written communications and corporate presentations, internet business applications and marketing, business planning and development. She is a big thinker with a passion for change. Over to you, Dr. Kathryn Chang Barker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice Chancellor, and thank you to Ishan as well here at the Open University of Sri Lanka for inviting me to this incredible opportunity. May I say I'm delighted to be in Sri Lanka, and this is an unexpected privilege to get to know more people here at the Open University, and I want to thank you very much. In the presentation, you all heard the word future and futurist several times, so thank you for that. And I imagine you feel as I do that life moves very, very fast and we are busy every day trying to think of the things we need to do today. And sometimes we stop and say, but what about the future? And what is the future going to be like? And what will the future be like for my children, as an example? So whereas we are often caught up in the present, we often think, well, what about the future? And I'm suggesting to you here in this presentation the best way to think about or predict the future is to invent it. So I want to spend a little time today telling you about what it's like to be a futurist, and particularly an education futurist, because there are many, many kinds. As an example, there are futurists who focus on military or on economics and politics. So from that broad field of what is a futurist, I've narrowed, and I want to tell you not only what that's like, and what I've learned as an education futurist, but I also want to encourage everybody to be a futurist. So I'm giving a little bit of an introduction then to the language that futurists use, and then I'll say, inshallah, we will all become futurists. You hear me say inshallah, because I am living and working in the Middle East. And I have been for almost 7 years. And so any of you who are familiar with having been in Dubai or in Oman or in Qatar will know that we pop the word inshallah into most sentences. So that's a bit of context. So when we think about the future, we often think it's out there someplace. And we use this kind of a metaphor of a spyglass and saying, well, let's just see, you know. And so I would ask you to think about yourself. How do you view the future? For some people, the future is only the past unfolding. Whatever was in the past will just go into the future. They don't think about change or any control over that. And in fact, different religions, different philosophies around the world will think about the future differently. And you can imagine in Islam then, where we say, inshallah, we're saying it's in God's hands. That means the future is also in God's hands. And so different ways of thinking about if the future is the past unfolding, or if I have some control over that. And can I make decisions? And can I do things that will change my future? And so we think about, good karma and thinking about how that, inshallah, should change our future to be better. So different ways of thinking about the future. Here are some sort of inspirational definitions, and they're quite complex. I won't spend too much time on them. But number one says, we should all be concerned about the future because we will have to spend the rest of our lives there. So we do have to think about it a little bit. That's where we're going to be, starting from this minute into the future. So this is where I say we all need to be futurists to some extent. But then some people say the future's not in my hands, inshallah. And some people would say there's nothing I can do, nor should I do, to manipulate the future. And the third notion is the world is full of people whose notion of a satisfactory future is in fact a return to an idealized past. So very often, especially when you're with older people, they will say, things were better in the past. In the good old days, they will say. In the good old days. And they seem to pine for and long for a return to that. So when they think into the future, what they are thinking is, could we please go back to the past? So their idea of the best future would be not to change too much with the ideas of progress and all of the things that go along with globalization. And then finally, a completely different notion that the future is here now, and it's just not widely distributed yet. So when we think sometimes of futurists, we think about science fiction. We think about the pictures they show us of technology controlling our lives, and we're wearing computer chips under our skin, and we're flying around in spaceships. And so people think the future is very spacey, very technology-based. And in many respects it is, which I will be telling you a little bit more about technology, but technology does really sort of drive our view of the future. And when we think about the things that technology can do and how it can change all of our lives in the present and in the future, then we could say, yes, it's already here. And, if you watch television, if you're on the internet, you see many, many, many technological innovations every day. And you can say, yes, that future is here. It's here now, if the future is about technology. And the notion that it's not widely distributed means it's not equally shared around the planet. That the globe is a fairly small place, but there are places where there's far more innovation and technology than in others. You could say, is that good or bad? I'm not sure. I'm not here to say something is better than something else. Just ways of thinking about constructing the future. So, some operational definitions then. A futurist is, first, the opposite of an historian. So I don't have some kind of crystal ball that tells me what the future is. Futurists don't do that. They don't know that. We don't know the future. We study the future. Just as historians study the past, we study the future. It's as simple as that. And there are tools that we use, which I will talk about. Second, I've already said, we are students of the future. And finally, one to be a futurist must be an optimist. An optimist is one who believes things are going to get better, or at least that there is a future. The opposite of an optimist is a pessimist. And the pessimist will say things are just going to get worse and worse and worse. Oh my goodness, and we really don't have much of a future. The environment is being destroyed and there's wars around the planet. Oh my goodness, we really don't have a future. That's a pessimist. So to be a futurist, you have to be an optimist. You have to believe things can get better and that you can be a part of that. That's what futurists are. They're optimists in a way. And I say we all need to be futurists. We all need to engage with our society in whatever ways that we can to create a better future. Not just for our children and not just for ourselves, but really for the good of Mother Earth. She's suffering. She's staggering under the things that we're doing to the planet. And so there are lots of reasons why we have to sort of take a good look at what we're doing and plan for a better future. And I say, and this is really one of my key messages to you, is that education and educators have a very special responsibility for the future. In Oman, I teach, and around in various places, I teach teachers, teacher preparation, faculty of education. And I say to young teachers, you have the most important job in the world. You have the future in your hands. How well you are able to work with children and with adults. I'm talking about teachers of all ages. You have the future in your hands. There is nothing more important than that, except maybe parenting. Parenting, of course. But if you're looking at paid employment or a job or a career or a profession, education, I would say, has the special responsibility for the future. So let's a little talk about what is a futurist, and here's some of the language that we use. Okay? First of all, we have these three notions of futures, different types of futures: the possible, the probable, and the preferred. So if you think about possible, you know what the word possible means. It means anything's possible, we could do this, or we could do this, or we could do this. Anything's possible. It could get worse, it could get better, it could stay the same. Who knows? Anything's possible. But probably, this is what's going to happen. And then we look at, as an example, trends. If this has happened and this has happened, then probably this will happen, So we look at the direction that trends go in, and we say, anything's possible, but, out of all that range of stuff, this is what's probably going to happen. So that's we talk about probable futures. And then finally we talk about preferred futures, and that's okay. From all of this stuff, what would we really like to see? And that's very often what you hear futurists say. This is my vision of a preferred future. This is language that I often use when I'm speaking to education leaders who all have different challenges that they're facing and different ways of looking at the solutions. And I would say, okay, all these things are possible. Given what we know about the past, probably this is what's going to happen. But in my vision of a preferred future, this is what I would like to see. And I hope that we all take time to think about our preferred future, because that's what we can work towards. And we say, futurists will say, a failure to plan is a plan to fail. So looking at that preferred future, it's not always achievable. And one of the tools then that futurists use is called scenario planning. Let's move on to some of the tools here. Number 2 says scenario building. When we think about trying to create a preferred future, and we think about, well, what does that scenario look like? And we try to describe in as many degrees as we can what that future would look like. But to get there, we need to have more than one scenario, because many things can happen to the plan. So we will create a best case scenario, a worst case scenario, and the middle case scenario, and here's the point, and plan for all three. So as futurists, we need to think about, well, this is where we'd like to go, but we've got a best, worst, and middle case scenario, and we're going to plan for all three. And there are some very good examples in history of major corporations surviving pretty difficult financial times because they had actually thought that might happen, and they had a plan. They didn't say, oh my goodness, something bad could happen. Oh, well, we'll deal with that when it happens. They had a plan, and that's what futurists contribute to organizations, is to help to make those different scenario plans so that you're planned for all eventualities. So I've mentioned trend analysis. You all know what trends are. And it's based on statistics for the most part. You see a rise in the numbers, so the trends go this way. And trends can go up or down, or they can, take loops this way and this way, or jaggedy. But we watch for a sort of a consistent pattern. And one of the best, I suppose, indicators of trends would be demographics. And I've mentioned here demographic analysis. Population growth by birth numbers is a very easy trend, really, to look at. The number of babies born each year and whether it's going up or down. And we know, as an example, that in some developed nations, Canada, my home country as an example, has a negative birth rate. So the trend, the demographic birth rate, growth rate it's a negative growth rate. What's a negative growth rate? A decline rate, I guess. So the trend is downward in terms of population growth in Canada. It's upward in other places. And try to remember this, too, that in many respects, demographics drive everything. Whether it's education or politics or the military, the sheer numbers of people, demographics, the sheer numbers of people in different categories are the primary drivers for decisions by policymakers, by governments, by good people and by evil people. Sheer numbers of people. So when we're thinking about creating a future, one of the tools we will use is purely demographic analysis. How many people do we have under the age of 25 versus over the age of 25? How many males versus females in schools? How many children able to go to school versus not able to go to school? So demographics are numbers of people, and it's a critical tool for futurists. But it's not the only one, because we also use, I didn't mention environmental scanning, and that means just looking around, seeing what's happening out there. Too often in our busy lives we get very narrow, and we think about, well, here in Sri Lanka, blah, 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 or in my case, here in Qatar, blah, blah, blah. And thankfully, now we have the internet. There is no excuse not to do environmental scanning. And in fact, when you go to the internet, with your search terms, you end up with more information than you can actually process. But we need to look at the big picture, what's happening in the big picture. I'm going to mention this a little bit more too in a moment. So here's a list of tools that we might use. These tools, a strategic foresight means foresight, as you know, is looking into the future. But so this is the strategic foresight is linked to strategic planning in a way, thinking about, well, there's all this stuff. So how do we narrow it to what is manageable? What is strategic? What is important? What is critical? What do we need to do now? And so bankers will often hire strategic foresight companies to give them good advice as to what's going to happen with the economy. And so it is strategic. Now, wildcards, interestingly, are things that you sort of can't predict. They're strange and sometimes very terrifying things that might happen, and you feel you can't really plan for them. Things like the dreadful tsunami that devastated much of Sri Lanka, devastated much of Indonesia, and even as far as Africa. On the one hand, you could say, oh yes, I suppose we should have emergency preparation, but at the same time, who could have predicted that incredibly devastating tsunami? But then if you put these natural disasters together, look what's happened to poor Japan with the tsunami, and then the number of earthquakes, and then some volcanic eruptions. So you say, oh my goodness, these bad, very large cataclysmic things happen, and can we plan for them or not? I have been attending for some time, at least in the past, the conferences of the World Future Society. And the presentations that I always appreciated and enjoyed the most came from the American military. Now you can say, well, why the American military? Because they have dedicated futurist institutes. And they actually think about all these wild cards, these horrifically devastating things that might happen. And they sort of have a plan. So I said, I sleep better at night, knowing that somebody's thinking about these and planning against them. And by way of example, I remember a fellow in a very, very fancy military uniform saying, our task is to preserve the office of the president 20 years into the future. So it wasn't about the president, not the person, not the body, but the office of the president. 20 years into the future, and to guard against all of the things that could possibly happen. I thought, good for you. I'm really glad you're doing that because I can't begin to think of all that. But there is this giant community of professional futurists doing these kinds of things. And then we create things like models, to show what might happen if, weather models or military models, and this, games, simulations. And so we use different tools like brainstorming to say, okay, let's get together a lot of people, let's think about all the things that could happen, let's look at the possibilities, the probabilities, and the preferred future, let's use these tools, and let's plan for a better future. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? I hope so. So there are some very noted futurists. The list goes on and on. I just mentioned here, perhaps you've heard of Alvin and Heidi Toffler. He wrote the book Power Shift, in fact, a whole series of futurist books that really brought his writing and his literature to the literature of contemporary thinking. And Al Gore, you might remember, was a vice president of the United States, but he is an environmental futurist. And Hazel Henderson is a person who you maybe never heard of, but she talks about different forms of economics and accounting for production and consumption in different ways than we currently use, as an example, the GDP. She has a different method of measuring economic production and consumption. And you've probably heard of Peter Drucker. He's a management guru, a management futurist, and Isaac Asimov, space travel. Leonardo da Vinci, well, now that's a name that goes back some ways. These other people are still living, I believe, but not Isaac Asimov, but Leonardo da Vinci, way back in the past. But if you looked at the work he did, it was exceptionally futurist, exceptionally futurist. And there was something in his brain that encouraged and allowed and promoted him to do that. And it's really fascinating to think of the things that he invented or predicted so very long ago. And the same with Lao Tzu, who is a Chinese philosopher, again, thinking about how the future would unfold, and even Lord Buddha himself, who, as we know, would say we need to be present in the moment, but our future moments will be better if we're better in the present, something along that line. So many people have given us good advice, some thoughts about what the future would look like. So there is, on the bookcase in most libraries, a bank of futurist literature. And this is what I began to accumulate and read as I was doing my PhD in something else. My PhD was actually in evaluation, in education administration. And I was doing a study of how to evaluate adult literacy programs. And I was going along on that track, and frankly, it was getting to be pretty boring. So at night, I would be reading these books about the future. And I came to understand that every book had at least one chapter in it about how education had to change. So if it was about the environmental problems, there was a chapter on how education had a role there. If it was about social or economic problems or political problems or military problems, always there was a chapter. And it came to me that really the people that I was studying with, doing PhD, and all the educators that I'd ever worked with, didn't actually connect to this literature. And again, I think it's one of the things I've learned is that we need to look more broadly when we think about what learning systems should be like. Educators spend too much time with educators. And educators read too many books on education, when in fact they should be reading maybe books on something else. And you'll find good thoughts, not just about the future in general, but about how learning systems should change in all of these areas. As an example, change management. So lots of conferences and books and texts on change management, on strategic planning, on crisis management, even in journalism and anthropology, in all of these areas, political science, military intelligence, business analysis, and educational leadership. There are facets of good advice, good information about how we could do a better job with our learning systems. So I changed my dissertation completely to become a forecast of change in Canada's education system. And I put in all of these good ideas that I found in all of these books that I'd been reading, and then we went through a computerized policy Delphi to see what we thought really would happen. It was very interesting. And I'm going to skip right now to the very end of my presentation and say, I predicted in this study in 1994, so almost more than 20 years ago now, certain things that would happen, and it wasn't me, it was my study. My respondents helped me to create a picture of the future. And it was very optimistic, it was very hopeful, it was very change-oriented. There was a lot of hope for things that that we're going to be better and different. And sadly, it hasn't happened. It just hasn't happened. When I reread my dissertation, I was blown away by the fact that nothing really has changed that much. So, let's talk about that. Futurist, that's the logo for the company that was mentioned to you. I am a futurist, and I'm not alone. There are lots of us, but I'm an education futurist, and I've just told you how I got started. I got started because I was bored doing routine education stuff and thought, all of this good information needs to be factored into how we think about preferred futures for learning. So, the technology, the sources then that I looked to then and look to now are essentially outside the education field. I don't like necessarily to go to education conferences because it's going to be the same stuff that I deal with every day. I want to go to a conference on technology or science or something I know nothing about, particularly the economy, let's say, you know? So in all of these fields, there are bodies of literature, there are conferences, there's research, there's good advice, and I think typically we see all of that, we know all of that, but we don't link it to learning systems. We think, oh, this is interesting, but I got to go back and teach my class. So we don't make that connection. So here's a simple tool that futurists use and that I would encourage people to use, or all of you to use. Study the news. Watch and see the trends. What's happening? More of this, less of this. Watch for things. And if you see something repeated in three times in different places, then you think, okay, there's something happening here. There's a trend. And then you ask the question, what are the implications of this for the future? And specifically, what are the implications for learning systems? So if we use a demographic trend as an example, where you have in Canada an aging population, that means that there are going to be fewer teachers because teachers are going to, available to be hired because as the population ages, people retire and they move out of the education field, and that means if you don't have an incoming large population, you've got a problem. The implications are you're going to have to find teachers someplace else. You're going to have to try to bring them as immigrants to Canada, or you're going to have to take a different look at who should be teachers. And this is important, I think, that we need to revisit who are the teachers in our systems. Because if you have this vast bank of retirees, people with life experience and really good ideas and great enthusiasm for life, it's so much knowledge, and then we say, but no, you can't come in the classroom. I would say we need to rethink that. We really rethink who are the teachers in these learning systems. So this is sort of how I operate. Maybe a more practical example. As I do a strategic plan for a quality assurance agency in the Middle East, the first thing I'm going to do is this environmental scan of the region and say, not just what's happening in education, but what are the new government priorities for human capital development? What are the threats to this country in terms of environmental issues or economic issues? Looking at the big picture. Because the learning system doesn't operate in isolation. It thinks it does in very many cases, but it does not and it cannot. So why not be more connected from the get-go? And so I mentioned a little bit earlier that the importance of technology for all of us. This is a quotation from a particular futurist who says, technology makes the rules and breaks the rules. And you've probably experienced that. But again, just a simple example. We thought that we were going to have to wire Africa so that everybody would have access to the internet. So cables, copper cables, we thought, oh, and it'll never happen. It'll take so long, I can't imagine how we're going to do that. And now we know we've gone straight to satellites, mobile devices, and mobile devices that are more powerful than most of our laptops, more powerful than this. I just the other day bought a new mobile, and I was looking at a small laptop too, and I realized the mobile was twice the price of the laptop. And I thought, how can this be? What's the deal here? These small mobiles are so incredibly powerful. No wonder they're more expensive. They are capable of so much more. And so in learning systems, now we talk much more about mobile learning than about e-learning, using mobile devices. So I'm not sure that this one is 1,000% true, but we say that changes in ICT affect all other trends. So the technology is connected to most of the trends. And so we now see a rise of e-everything. there's the trends in technology around miniaturization. I've just mentioned this mobile phone. This is my mobile phone here. My mobile phone is full. It's just completely packed with miniature capabilities. And I fully anticipate, now many people now have smart watches, right? I fully anticipate that soon we won't bother carrying around a smartphone. It'll be something that's part of either our clothing or our jewelry or possibly embedded in our skin. And I'm not trying to predict, I've read this, I didn't make this up, okay? But ubiquity means that it's everywhere. It's everywhere. And it doesn't matter where you go. I travel the world. You saw it, my introduction says I'm a world traveler. I love traveling. I love it. I love it. And it doesn't matter where you go. If you stop for a second and look around, most people are on their mobile. They're either talking to somebody or they're looking. So you see a bullock cart in the middle of nowhere, Argentina, where there's barely paved roads, and people make a living by herding cattle. And on this big bullock cart, there's an elderly woman and a child, and she's busily looking at her internet. I'm thinking, cool, cool. But the upside of that, the upside is it's available to us. The downside is you can't get away from it. You can't get away from it. And so people now are watching their mobiles have become a real pedestrian problem, right? Because they're looking like this and then they're walking into each other, Anyways, it's everywhere. Ubiquity means it's everywhere. And then, robotics, completely different topic. People might fear that we will be replaced by robots, even in the education field. And then another trend, social networking, which is an amazing trend, really. Very difficult to think or predict where that one's going because it's moving so very fast. So, in fact, there are people who are just technology futurists. And I'm sure you're familiar with some of those names. And it does relate to what we do, but it's not the heart and soul of what we do as educators. So what have I learned? How am I doing for time, Ishan? Okay? So what have I learned? These are some key points. I would say they're not nice things to say, but it's simply true. In my view, we need to change everything about our learning systems. The who, what, where, when, why, and how. So what do I mean by that? I've already mentioned, I think, we need to revisit who are the teachers in our learning systems, that we've narrowed it to a field of professional practice, which is useful, or was useful in terms of developing learning systems, but if you take a competency-based approach, there's no reason why many other people couldn't also be engaged in the teaching process. And I would go so far as to say, as we dream of the vision of lifelong learning, we would also think of lifelong teaching at the same time. So in the core competencies that we pass on to all learners should be teaching skills. And we can all take on teaching and learning roles over a lifetime. And that's just a sort of an example of the who, teaching side. Then the who are the students, Again, we've got this lockstep system. You're 6 years old, in you go. You're in this elementary classroom. You're 12 years old, you move on to middle school. You're 18 years old, into university. It's very age-related. With all of the things we now know about learning, age should have no relevance whatsoever to our learning systems. Competencies, yes. Abilities and opportunities, yes. But age should be irrelevant, and it can be. We know how to do that. We know how to change all of these things. The what we teach, curriculum. We have in the past been spending, I think, a great deal of time teaching things that people don't seem to need to know, at least at the time we teach them, and not the things they do need to know. As an example, parenting skills. We have, in many societies, massive problems with parenting skills because nobody's ever sat down and thought, what would a curriculum look like and how should we expect adults to function as parents in our society? And so you end up with massive problems of juvenile crime and, and health-related problems. In the Middle East, we have a staggering statistic of diabetes. And that diabetes comes from eating the wrong things, too much sugary drinks, too much sugary food. And who's responsible for what children eat? The parents. But did anybody tell the parents it was a bad idea? Probably not, So we have to think through as what we want citizens to be able to do as parents, as voters, as many other things, and think about what a curriculum should look like. We would simply ask the question, what do people need to learn? And where's the best place to learn that? So the where. Is it in schools? Maybe, maybe not. In the past, schools were far more embedded in communities. But now we build these institutions, and we build them bigger and bigger and bigger. And if I'm the first person to tell you this, I hope you think about it a little bit. Bigger is not better. In fact, the best high schools now are where they take these big facilities for 15,000 and break them into 5 small schools. One facility maybe, but 5 schools, because we need human connections. Bigger does not make for better learning in most cases. So, in all aspects, the who, what, where, when, why, and how. We know how to change it. We can do that. But we're not actually able to make any real shifts. And I'm at a loss as to exactly why that is the case. But it seems to me that the real problem is we're asking educators to change the education system. And that's not fair. Educators are the people for whom the system worked. They're the ones who were successful in it. I'm a product of that. I have a PhD. Obviously, I figured out how to use the learning system. I learned how to write a good research paper, learned how to pay attention in class, learned how to do exams, and stayed with the system. Sometimes, I'll admit this, in a lecture hall of 500 people, I wasn't always awake, but I managed to get through the system. It worked for me. To ask educators to change learning systems is unfair. Many of them know nothing else. They were successful as students, now they're successful as teachers, and if you said, well, let's change things, they'd say, why? It's just fine, works for me, you know? So, we need to think about who is better positioned to help us bring about change. And this is why, and I have not actually worked inside the education system since graduating, because I felt I could only critique from the outside. So there have to be outside animators, and that's what I've become as a change agent, somebody from the outside who animates for change. And will never have the kind of authority that it takes to make radical transformation. But I say here, by way of example, you might remember this big push to move from teacher-focused to student-focused. And much of the literature in the last few years has been about moving from being the sage on the stage as a teacher to the guide on the side, you know? So from teacher-focused to learner-focused. And I'm suggesting we need to take one more leap, and that's to learning-focused. And when we focus on the learning, on the competencies, on the abilities, on the attitudes, then we reshape. We reshape all of the things about who, where, why, what, and how. So if we move from teacher-focused through to learning-focused, we're pretty good at that now, I think. We talk about engaged learning and fostering positive learning, that sort of thing. But let's take the learner out of it and talk about learning. And what is the content that we need? I think that this is one way to think about creating a preferred future. And I say that change seems to be happening too slowly and we're only tinkering. I told you that. My study predicted things that haven't happened in 20 years. Things like individualized education. We know how to do this, but we don't do it. We have the technology to do it. We don't do it. We have the ability to bring in different kinds of teachers, different kind of curriculum. We don't do it. We stick with the old habits. So I think where can we actually begin to make a difference? And face it, I'm not a young person anymore. I like to think I am, but really, you know, sometime in the next 40 years, I'm going to end my career. So I think, okay, if I'm told where would you start, Dr. Barker? I would start with teacher education. This is where I think we need to rethink how we prepare people and who those people even are. I have a son who didn't finish high school. I took it as a personal insult. How can you do this to me? How can you not finish high school when I'm doing a PhD in education administration? But when he explained to me why he didn't want to and what his situation was, I understood. And I realized I had to become an advocate for those people for whom the system doesn't work. And maybe those are the people we should be thinking about bringing in to advise us and help us to decide what our future learning systems should look like. And I want to say that this whole movement towards open universities and open learning and open education resources is really a step in the right direction and very much to be applauded. And I'm very much happy to be a part of that. But still, so far to go. Some last observations. What have I learned? That STEM, you know, this is the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM. Right now there's big pushes around the world to have a greater emphasis on STEM. And on STEAM, they put arts in there as well. So STEM and STEAM, and there's lots of conferences and presentations and workshops, they say it's so important, it's critical, to the point where they're cutting out things like culture classes, art and music and dance. They're cutting out phys ed and international education to focus on science and technology, education and management. And I say, yes, that's important, but so is yoga. And I use the word yoga there to indicate all those other things that make us a better human being, that make us a more stable, confident, capable human being, that we learn from the elders, from wise people, from simple processes. Not that yoga is simple. I've just spent a week studying yoga. It's not simple, but it's a way that should be considered to allow people to be better learners, to be better engaged with their society. And I say that, we've talked about lifelong learning for as long as I can remember. It's never really been actualized because we didn't really have incentives. We said, yes, it's important. People should learn for a lifetime. But we didn't say, and then we're going to use it in some way, or we're going to reward you in some way. We just said, keep learning. You have to keep learning. But we didn't say why or how. Now we have tools, like ePortfolio tools, that make it eminently easy and appropriate to do that. So I say it's the silver bullet. As an education futurist, I believe ePortfolio tools are the way to help us to invent a better future in learning systems. So I think my time is up. I think I should just say, I don't know what the future holds, but I know who holds the future. It's in your hands. And to remember that learning and change are the same thing. That if we want to see positive change, we have to continue to be learning. And again, I want to thank you for this terrific opportunity, and I will just say I have a question that I want to pose to our Vice Chancellor. And if he wants to address this, he's most welcome, and if he says, no, I have questions for you, that's fine too. But thank you very, very much. I think now I'll move over here, yeah?
Okay. You said the future is the opposite of history, or whatever. Yeah. So, but I would say that futurists need to be an historian as well. And how will you respond to that?
I would absolutely agree with you. I've thought about that and just really recently. We hear it say, if we don't learn from the past, we repeat it. So you're absolutely correct. Linking the past into and moving it into the future is important. If we don't learn the lessons, we make the same mistakes over again. So we're agreed on that.
Okay, yeah. One more thing with that, those terminologies and definitions. When you spoke about these type of futures, you used 3 words, possible, probable, and preferred.
Yes.
Does that mean that in future there is nothing definite?
That's a good question, No, I would say there's nothing definite because we can, by our decisions each day, change what our futures will be like. And so on an institutional level, as you're managing an entire institution, yeah, you can make a really big difference with a small change. And even if you made no decisions and no changes, the future is still going to just unfold because other impacts will be felt from society.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If we knew the future, we'd be rich. There's a movie about these people who find out how to, some engineers have created a method of actually seeing the future, and they kill off the engineers in the movie because they know it's too dangerous. People don't want to know this. They don't want to know the actual future. That's interesting, isn't it? We don't actually want to know. We just want to think that we can shape it in a better way.
Or I would like to ask one more thing. Now, this is regarding, you were saying that change is happening too slowly in one of your slides. Oh, that's true, even in the education sector. What do you think are the impediments for this change? Because it's not in pace with the other changes which are taking. Education is not going in pace with the other changes which are taking place outside. What do you think are the impediments and how we could overcome that?
Well, it's a challenge and it's difficult, but I think one of the impediments, as I've said earlier, is that educators aren't the best people to try to bring about the change, but that's where we throw it. We throw the ball into the court of professional education and say, change the system, and they don't know really what to change it to or how to change it. They're busy in their classrooms. They're busy doing their research. So it's a kind of a manpower issue. Who should be there? I think that money doesn't seem to be have been an impediment. Many governments will say, yes, we see the importance of education, but others might say there's not enough spent there. But again, for me, the biggest impediment is not looking outside education. Sometimes people will say, schools should be run more like businesses. And I would say, well, not necessarily that, but let's look at businesses and see how they are efficient with resources and time. And let's look at, as an example, time management systems, digital systems that they use. Let's learn from other sectors. And we tend not to learn. I think that's the biggest impediment. We think we're fine the way we are. Don't bother us, we're busy.
We are comfortable with what we are.
Exactly, yes.
And something, I would like to ask something from your personal experience at what you are doing at Qatar. And what do you think, how in Qatar or in all of the Middle East, what's the direction in which this education, development and all those, in which direction are they going?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I would say, without question, the biggest impetus right now, the most time and energy is spent on quality assurance, quality improvement, quality standards, accreditation. There seem to be now a body of institutions and people doing this, the educating, and now they're saying, how good is it? And is it good enough? And how can we enter the global marketplace with our students? And how can we seek international accreditation? And so every country right now is working on quality assurance and quality improvement, I would say.
I think with that, can we close it? And I would like to thank you once again.
Oh, you're more than welcome.
For coming over to Sri Lanka and then giving us this wonderful lecture. Thank you very much, Dr.
Oh, you're
Bhatta.
most welcome. Thank you.